The pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918, was shattered by the most devastating artillery barrage in American military history. Along a 24-mile front stretching from the Meuse River to the dense Argonne forest, over 4,000 Allied guns erupted in synchronized fury, their muzzle flashes illuminating the faces of 900,000 American and French soldiers. Crouched in their trenches, General John Joseph Pershing stood in his forward command post, his weathered hands gripping the wooden table as the earth trembled beneath his feet. The thunderous roar of artillery seemed to shake the very foundations of the Western Front. This was at the final gamble that would either break the German lines or cost the American Expeditionary Forces everything they had fought for over the past 18 months. "Sir, the barrage has been continuous for 3 hours," reported Colonel George Marshall, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. "The Germans haven't responded with counter-battery fire. Their positions must be taking tremendous punishment." Pershing nodded grimly, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the map spread before him. The Meuse Argonne sector represented the most formidable defensive position on the Western Front, a natural fortress of dense forests, steep ridges, and interlocking fields of fire that the Germans had spent for years fortifying. The Hindenburg Line ran through this terrain like a steel backbone, studded with concrete bunkers, barbed wire entanglements, and machine gun nests positioned to turn any advance into a slaughter. The weight of command pressed heavily on Pershing's shoulders. President Woodrow Wilson had entrusted him with transforming American boys into soldiers capable of fighting alongside battle-hardened French and British veterans. Now, as the largest American offensive of the war was about to begin, Pershing knew that the fate of the Allied cause, and perhaps the war itself, rested on the shoulders of his doughboys. According to military historian Edward Lengel's detailed analysis into Conquer Hell, the Meuse Argonne, 1918, the scale of this offensive was unprecedented in American military history. In the trenches, Private First Class Henry Johnson of the 369th Infantry Regiment, one of the African-American units fighting with French forces, checked his rifle for the 100th time. The Harlem Hellfighters, as they were known, had already proven their worth in earlier battles, but nothing had prepared them for the magnitude of what lay ahead. The German positions loomed before them like a medieval fortress, complete with multiple defensive lines that stretched back for miles. The artillery barrage reached its crescendo as 0 hour approached. Shells screamed overhead in an endless procession, their explosions creating a hellish landscape of smoke, fire, and flying debris. German trenches disappeared beneath the storm of steel, but Pershing knew that the enemy had learned to weather such bombardments in deep concrete shelters, emerging only when the infantry began their advance. As the first rays of dawn pierced the smoke-filled sky, whistles began to blow along the American lines. The moment of truth had arrived. In a few minutes, the largest American army ever assembled would go over the top in an offensive that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the emergence of the United States as a world power. The thunder of artillery began to lift, shifting to targets deeper behind German lines. In the sudden relative quiet, the sounds of 900,000 men preparing for battle filled the air. The metallic click of bayonets being fixed, the whispered prayers, the final checks of equipment. History was about to unfold in the killing fields of the Meuse Argonne. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the whistles shrieked along the Allied lines. From the Meuse River to the depths of the Argonne forest, American soldiers emerged from their trenches like a human tide, their bayonets gleaming in the pale morning light. The Great War's final and most decisive offensive had begun. First Lieutenant Edith Norse Rogers, serving as a Red Cross volunteer near the front lines, watched in awe as waves of doughboys advanced across no man's land. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Hundreds of thousands of young Americans moving forward with determination etched on their faces, their olive-drab uniforms stark against the scarred landscape. The First Army's assault began with remarkable success, the 77th Division, advancing through the treacherous Argonne forest, made surprising progress through the dense undergrowth. Major Charles Whittlesey led his battalion deeper into the German lines than anyone had dared hope, while to their right, The 28th Division pushed forward against lighter resistance than expected, but the German response was swift and brutal as the American infantry moved beyond the range of their supporting artillery. Concealed machine gun nests erupted in deadly crossfire. The distinctive rattle of Maxim guns filled the air as German defenders, emerging from their deep bunkers like deadly phantoms, began to exact a terrible toll on the advancing Americans. Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Division found himself pinned down with his squad in a shell crater as German machine guns swept the ground around them. The Tennessee sharpshooter, who had initially registered as a conscientious objector before finding his calling as a soldier, surveyed the chaos around him with calculating eyes. American bodies lay scattered across the battlefield, testament to the devastating effectiveness of German defensive tactics. In the Argonne forest, the advance quickly became a nightmare of confusion and desperate fighting. The dense woodland broke up unit formations, making coordination nearly impossible. Companies became separated from their battalions, and individual squads found themselves fighting isolated battles against German strongpoints hidden among the trees. Major Whittlesey's battalion had pushed so far forward that they became cut off from the main American lines, surrounded by German forces and running low on ammunition. These lost battalion soldiers would become symbols of American determination and sacrifice. Their desperate radio messages back to headquarters painted a grim picture of the offensive's early challenges. The German defenders, commanded by Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had prepared for this assault with typical Prussian thoroughness. Their defensive strategy relied on defense in depth, allowing the Americans to advance into carefully prepared killing zones before launching devastating counterattacks. Elite stormtroopers, equipped with flamethrowers and stick grenades, infiltrated American positions to create chaos and confusion. Colonel Douglas MacArthur, commanding the 42nd Rainbow Division, led his men in a desperate assault on German positions near Château-Chiavari. The future general, known for his flamboyant leadership style and refusal to wear a helmet, personally directed the attack while German shells burst around him. His division made significant gains, but at a horrific cost in casualties. By the end of the first day, American forces had advanced up to 3 miles in some sectors, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of doughboys lay dead or wounded across the battlefield, their sacrifice measured in yards of blood-soaked French soil. Medical Corps personnel worked frantically to evacuate the wounded, while ammunition carriers struggled to resupply forward units through the maze of shell craters and wire entanglements. General Pershing, reviewing the day's reports in his headquarters, faced a difficult decision. The offensive had achieved some success, but at a pace and cost that could not be sustained. The German defensive lines were proving even more formidable than anticipated, and American inexperience in large-scale warfare was showing. Yet retreat was not an option. Too much was at stake, and the Allies were counting on American success to force Germany to the negotiating table. As night fell over the battlefield, both sides prepared for the grinding attritional warfare that would define the next phase of the offensive. October 2nd, 1918, found Major Charles Whittlesey and his 550 men of the 77th Division trapped in a shallow ravine deep within the Argonne forest. What would become known as the Lost Battalion was neither lost nor a battalion, but rather a collection of companies from multiple units who had advanced too far, too fast, and now found themselves surrounded by German forces on all sides. The morning mist clung to the dense forest as German voices echoed through the trees, calling out commands and positioning machine guns to tighten the noose around the American position. Whittlesey, a former Wall Street lawyer turned soldier, surveyed his desperate situation with the same analytical mind that had once dissected corporate contracts. His men were running dangerously low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, while German snipers picked off anyone who dared show themselves above the shallow earthworks. They had hastily dug. Private Omer Richards, barely 19 years old and hailing from a farm in Kansas, pressed himself against the muddy walls of their improvised foxhole as German shells whistled overhead. The boy had enlisted with dreams of adventure and glory, But the reality of modern warfare was a far cry from the romantic notions that had filled his head back home, around him. Wounded soldiers groaned in pain, while medics worked frantically with dwindling supplies. The Germans, recognizing the tactical advantage of eliminating this advanced American position, launched repeated attacks throughout the day. Waves of field gray uniforms emerged from the forest, their distinctive spiked helmets bobbing as they advanced with methodical precision. The rattle of machine gun fire mixed with the sharp crack of rifles, and the distinctive boom of stick grenades exploding in the American position. Captain Nelson Holderman, second in command and nursing a severe leg wound, helped coordinate the defense alongside Whittlesey. The two officers knew that their position was becoming more precarious by the hour. German artillery had found their range, and each barrage brought the enemy shells closer to their pathetic defenses. Worse still, they had lost radio contact with headquarters, leaving them completely isolated from any hope of relief or resupply. Historical records from the National Archives, as documented in Robert Laplander's Finding the Lost Battalion, reveal the desperate messages sent by carrier pigeon from the surrounded Americans. The most tragic incident occurred when American artillery, unaware of the battalion's exact position, began shelling what they believed to be German-held territory. The screaming shells fell directly into the American position, killing and wounding men who had already endured days of combat. In desperation, Whittlesey released his last carrier pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami, with a message pleading for the artillery to stop firing on their own men. Sergeant Ben Geddick, a German-American who spoke fluent German, found himself in the surreal position of translating enemy communications intercepted by American listeners. The irony was not lost on him, his own heritage tied to the enemy they fought, yet his loyalty firmly with his American comrades. Through the intercepted messages, they learned that the Germans were planning a major assault for the following morning. As the third day of their ordeal dawned, German forces launched their most determined attack yet, led by veteran stormtroopers armed with flamethrowers and automatic weapons. The assault came from three directions simultaneously. The Americans, many wounded and all exhausted, fought with the desperation of men who knew that surrender meant either death or a German prison camp. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, despite being wounded in the leg, volunteered for the most dangerous mission of all, attempting to crawl through German lines to reach American positions and guide relief forces back to the trapped battalion. The young soldier from New York's Lower East Side had already proven his courage multiple times, but this mission would test every ounce of his determination and cunning. The forest around them had become a hellscape of splintered trees, muddy shell craters, and the debris of modern warfare. Dead soldiers from both sides lay scattered among the undergrowth, silent testimony to the savage fighting that had raged for days. The smell of cordite, blood, and death hung heavy in the autumn air, while the constant threat of sniper fire kept every survivor on edge. By nightfall, Whittlesey's command had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective fighters, yet their desperate stand had accomplished something crucial. They had drawn significant German forces away from other sectors of the front, allowing other American units to consolidate their gains and prepare for the next phase of the offensive. The morning of October 8, 1918, dawned gray and cold in the Argonne forest as Sergeant Alvin York and his patrol of 17 men from the 82nd Division moved through the dense undergrowth. On what seemed like a routine mission, their objective was simple: locate and neutralize a German machine gun nest that had been causing heavy casualties among advancing American troops. None of them could have imagined that this day would produce one of the most legendary acts of individual heroism in American military history. York, a devoutly religious man from the Tennessee mountains who had initially sought exemption from military service as a conscientious objector, led his men with quiet confidence through the treacherous terrain. His exceptional marksmanship skills, honed through years of hunting in the Cumberland Mountains, would soon be put to the ultimate test against human prey rather than woodland game. The patrol had advanced only a few hundred yards when they stumbled upon a German headquarters position hidden in a natural depression in the forest floor. Before the Americans could react, German soldiers began emerging from concealed positions. Their rifles and machine pistols trained on the outnumbered Americans. In the ensuing firefight, 9 American soldiers were killed or wounded within the first few minutes, leaving York and the 7 surviving members of his patrol in desperate straits. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. As German machine guns opened fire from multiple positions, York found himself in a position where he could engage the enemy without exposing his wounded comrades to further danger. Drawing upon his hunting instincts and remarkable shooting ability, he began systematically picking off German soldiers with his Springfield rifle. Each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly accurate. The German machine gunners, unable to depress their weapons enough to target York's position, found themselves helpless against his deadly marksmanship. One by one, York eliminated the gun crews, his calm demeanor and methodical approach creating panic among the enemy soldiers, who had never encountered such precise individual firepower. Lieutenant Paul Valmer, commanding the German position, watched in amazement as his carefully prepared defenses crumbled before the deadly accuracy of a single American soldier. When York's rifle ammunition ran low, the Tennessee sergeant seamlessly switched to his Colt automatic pistol, continuing his deadly work without missing a beat. The precision with which he engaged multiple targets simultaneously defied belief, according to official U.S. Army records maintained at the center of military history. York's actions resulted in the capture of 132 German prisoners and the elimination of 35 machine gun nests. Meanwhile, in another sector of the forest, the rescue of Major Whittlesey's lost battalion was finally underway. Colonel Cromwell Stacy led elements of the 77th Division in a desperate assault to reach the surrounded Americans. The relief force fought through intense German resistance, their advance measured in yards gained at the cost of dozens of casualties. Private Krotoshinsky, who had successfully crawled through German lines 3 days earlier, now guided the relief column through the maze of German defensive positions. His intimate knowledge of the enemy's layout proved invaluable, as American forces methodically cleared each strong point blocking their path to the trapped battalion. The sound of approaching American forces electrified the survivors of the lost battalion. Major Whittlesey, barely able to stand after days without sleep or adequate food, rallied his remaining men for one final defensive effort. They knew that German forces would make every attempt to eliminate them before relief could arrive. Captain Holderman, his leg wound now badly infected, directed the battalion's remaining machine gunners in supporting the relief effort. Their accurate fire helped suppress German positions that threatened to halt the advancing rescue column. Every bullet counted, as their ammunition supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The meeting between the relief force and the lost battalion came just as German reinforcements arrived to contest the rescue. A three-way battle erupted in the forest clearing as American rescuers, trapped Americans, and German defenders fought desperately for control of the strategic position. The sound of battle echoed through the trees as men from both sides displayed extraordinary courage. Under impossible circumstances, Sergeant York, meanwhile, continued his incredible one-man assault on the German position when a German major attempted to rally his men for a counterattack. York's deadly accurate pistol fire ended the threat immediately. The psychological impact of watching their officers fall to the American marksman's unerring accuracy broke the morale of the remaining German defenders. As the sun set on October 8th, two of the war's most famous actions had reached their climax. York's patrol had captured more German prisoners than many entire battalions, while the lost battalion had finally been relieved after their heroic 5-day stand. Both actions would become symbols of American determination and individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds. October 14th, 1918, marked the beginning of the most crucial phase of the Meuse Argonne offensive as American forces prepared to assault the formidable Hindenburg Line itself. General Pershing knew that breaking through this ultimate German defensive position would require every ounce of tactical skill and raw courage his army could muster. The heavily fortified line stretched across the most defensible terrain on the Western Front, bristling with concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The Assault began before dawn with another massive artillery barrage, but this time the Germans were ready. Counter-battery fire erupted from concealed positions as German artillery commanders sought to neutralize American guns. Before they could effectively support the infantry attack, the duel between opposing artillery forces lit up the pre-dawn sky with muzzle flashes and explosions, creating a deadly light show that could be seen for miles. Colonel George Patton, commanding a tank brigade in support of the infantry assault, led his armored vehicles forward through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. The future general's aggressive leadership style was already evident as he personally directed his tanks from an exposed position, seemingly oblivious to the German shells bursting around him. His armor provided crucial support to the advancing infantry, but the primitive tanks of 1918 were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable to well-placed artillery fire. The 1st Division, Pershing's elite Big Red One, spearheaded the assault on the most heavily fortified section of the German line. These veteran soldiers, hardened by months of combat, advanced with the methodical precision that had earned them their fearsome reputation. Yet even these experienced troops found themselves facing defensive positions more formidable than anything they had previously encountered. Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, whose Rainbow Division had suffered heavy casualties in earlier phases of the offensive, led his remaining troops in a flanking movement designed to turn the German defensive line. MacArthur's theatrical leadership style, he carried no weapon and wore no helmet, claiming that fate would protect him, inspired his men even as it horrified his superiors. His division's advance through the difficult terrain of the Champagne sector proved crucial to the overall success of the assault. Military historian Donald Smythe's comprehensive analysis in Pershing, General of the Armies, documents the complex coordination required for this multi-division assault on the German defensive line. Private Murphy, an Irish-American soldier from Boston serving with the 26th Yankee Division, found himself face-to-face with the reality of assaulting prepared defensive positions. The German bunkers seemed impregnable, their concrete walls scarred but unbroken by the preliminary bombardment. Machine gun fire swept the approaches to these positions, creating deadly zones where advancing infantry fell in heaps. The breakthrough came through a combination of tactical innovation and individual heroism. American engineers, working under intense fire, managed to breach the wire obstacles and clear paths through the German minefields. Simultaneously, specially trained assault teams used concentrated firepower and explosive charges to neutralize key defensive positions. Captain Harry Truman, commanding a battery of field artillery in the 35th Division, provided crucial fire support for the advancing infantry. The future president's battery delivered devastating, accurate fire on German strongpoints, often working so close to the front lines that they risked hitting their own troops. Truman's leadership under fire earned him the respect of his men and demonstrated the courage that would later serve him in the White House. The German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat here might mean the end of their homeland's hopes for victory. Veterans of 4 years of warfare, they had seen the gradual deterioration of Germany's position and understood that the Hindenburg Line represented their last realistic chance to halt the Allied advance. Their resistance was fierce and professional, making every yard of ground cost the Americans dearly. By late afternoon, cracks began to appear in the German defensive line. American units had penetrated the outer defenses in several locations, though at enormous cost in casualties. The breakthrough, when it came, resulted from the cumulative effect of multiple small successes rather than any single dramatic breakthrough. As darkness fell on October 14th, American forces had achieved what many military experts had thought impossible. They had broken through the Hindenburg Line at multiple points. The German defensive system that had held the Western Front stable for years was finally crumbling under the weight of American determination and firepower. The cost had been horrific. Thousands of American soldiers lay dead or wounded across the battlefield, their sacrifice measured in the precious yards of ground that brought the Allies closer to final victory. Yet the strategic significance of the day's fighting was unmistakable. Germany's last major defensive line had been breached, and the road to German territory now lay open October 21st, 1918, witnessed the beginning of the German Army's systematic collapse in the Meuse Argonne sector. What had begun as an orderly fighting withdrawal was rapidly deteriorating into something approaching panic, as German commanders realized that their last major defensive line had been irreparably breached. The psychological impact of the Hindenburg Line's fall spread throughout the German ranks like wildfire, shattering the morale of units that had held firm through 4 years of brutal warfare. General Max von Bohn, commanding the German army group that faced the American assault, received increasingly desperate reports from his subordinate commanders. Entire regiments were abandoning their positions without orders, while others reported that their men were simply walking away from the war. The iron discipline that had held the German army together through years of carnage was finally cracking under the relentless pressure of American attacks and the growing realization that the war was lost. The American advance, which had been measured in yards for weeks, suddenly accelerated as German resistance collapsed. The First Army's pursuit of the retreating Germans became a race to seize key objectives. Before the enemy could establish new defensive lines further to the rear, American cavalry units, seeing their first significant action since the war began, galloped through gaps in the German lines to disrupt enemy communications and supply lines. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., eldest son of the former president, led his regiment in the pursuit with characteristic Roosevelt family aggression. The younger Roosevelt had already distinguished himself in earlier fighting, and now found himself at the spearhead of an advance that was rewriting the map of the Western Front daily. His reports to higher headquarters painted a picture of a German army in full retreat, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape encirclement in the German rear areas. The situation was becoming increasingly chaotic. Supply convoys found themselves under attack by American aircraft, while long-range artillery fire disrupted communications between German headquarters and their forward units. The carefully constructed infrastructure that had supported 4 years of German defensive warfare was collapsing as rapidly as the front lines themselves. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading fighter ace, led his squadron in continuous attacks on German airfields and supply columns. The American air offensive, which had been building throughout the Meuse Argonne campaign, now achieved air superiority over the battlefield. German aircraft, already handicapped by fuel shortages and pilot losses, could no longer provide effective support to their ground forces. The human cost of the German retreat was becoming increasingly apparent to American forces as they advanced through abandoned German positions. Hospitals overflowing with wounded German soldiers had been left behind, while supply dumps contained clear evidence of the deteriorating condition of the German army. Equipment was in poor repair, uniforms were patched and worn, and food supplies consisted largely of ersatz substitutes that spoke to Germany's desperate economic situation. Contemporary accounts from the American Battle Monuments Commission, as recorded in their official history of the Meuse Argonne campaign, document the rapid change in German resistance during this critical period. Major General Hunter Liggett, who had recently assumed command of the First Army from Pershing, pressed his advantage relentlessly. The veteran general recognized that this might be the decisive moment of the war, and he was determined to give the Germans no opportunity to recover their balance. American divisions that had been battered in the earlier fighting were reinforced and thrown back into the advance, while fresh units were committed to maintain the momentum of the pursuit. The German withdrawal was complicated by the presence of hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the advancing American forces. Roads designed for military traffic became clogged, with civilian families carrying their possessions, creating massive traffic jams that made orderly military movement almost impossible. German commanders found themselves trying to manage a military retreat while simultaneously dealing with a humanitarian crisis. Private William Sawyer, a machine gunner with the 2nd Division, witnessed scenes that would remain with him for the rest of his life as American forces advanced through recently abandoned German positions. The evidence of Germany's deteriorating situation was everywhere, from the poor quality of German equipment to the obvious malnutrition of captured German soldiers. It was clear that Germany was losing the war on the home front as well as on the battlefield. The speed of the American advance began to create its own problems. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point as ammunition, food, and medical supplies struggled to keep pace with the rapidly advancing front lines. American forces found themselves in the paradoxical situation of advancing so quickly that their own logistics system could barely support them. By the end of October 21st, American forces had advanced over 10 miles in a single day, a rate of progress that would have been unimaginable during the earlier phases of the offensive. The German army that had held the Western Front stable for years was disintegrating before the eyes of amazed American soldiers, who had grown accustomed to measuring success in yards rather than miles. November 11th, 1918, dawned cold and misty along the Meuse River, as American artillery crews prepared for what they did not yet know would be their final bombardment of the Great War. At precisely 11 o'clock that morning, an armistice would take effect, but until that moment, the killing continued with mechanical precision. The irony was not lost on many soldiers that men would die in the final minutes of a war that had already been decided by diplomacy rather than arms. General Pershing stood in his headquarters at Chaumont, reviewing the final casualty reports from his commanders. The Meuse Argonne offensive had cost the American Expeditionary Forces over 26,000 dead and 95,000 wounded, making it the bloodiest battle in American military history up to that point. Yet the strategic objective had been achieved. German resistance had collapsed, and their delegates were even now signing the armistice agreement that would end for years of unprecedented carnage. At the front lines, soldiers on both sides watched the clock with a mixture of anticipation and bitter irony. Private Henry Gunther of the 313th Infantry Regiment would have the dubious honor of becoming the last American soldier killed in action when he was shot down by German machine gunners at 10:59, just 1 minute before the armistice took effect. His death epitomized the senseless waste of war's final moments, when political decisions had already rendered military action meaningless. The silence that fell over the Western Front at 11 o'clock was almost supernatural in its completeness. After 4 years of continuous artillery fire, machine gun rattle, and rifle shots, the sudden absence of sound seemed to ring in soldiers' ears. Men who had grown accustomed to sleeping through bombardments found themselves unable to rest in the profound quiet that settled over the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, whose tank brigade had spearheaded much of the American advance, found himself strangely melancholy as the fighting ended. The aggressive young officer had found his calling in the crucible of modern warfare, and the prospect of returning to peacetime duty held little appeal. His prophetic comment to his aide that they would probably have to fight the Germans again would prove eerily accurate 23 years later. In the Argonne forest, Major Whittlesey visited the site where his lost battalion had made their famous stand. Just weeks earlier, the forest floor was still littered with the debris of battle-rusted equipment, unexploded shells, and the crude graves of soldiers from both sides who had died in the fighting. The major reflected on the transformation of his men from untested civilians to hardened veterans, a metamorphosis purchased with blood and suffering. The German army's collapse had been so complete that many American units found themselves advancing unopposed. In the final days of the war, German soldiers, realizing that the end was near, simply laid down their weapons and walked toward the American lines with their hands raised. The disciplined retreat had given way to wholesale surrender as word of the armistice negotiations spread through the German ranks. Historical records from the Hoover Institution archives, as documented by historian David Kennedy in Over Here, The First World War and American Society, capture the complex emotions of soldiers as the war ended. Sergeant Alvin York, whose heroic actions had made him a national hero, spent the final morning of the war helping to evacuate wounded German prisoners. The Tennessee sharpshooter's transformation from pacifist to warrior and back to humanitarian embodied the complex moral journey that many American soldiers had experienced during their time in France. The cost of the Meuse Argonne offensive extended far beyond the immediate casualty figures. Entire American communities had been devastated by the loss of their young men. while the psychological trauma of industrial warfare would haunt survivors for decades to come. Yet the offensive had achieved its strategic objective. It had broken the back of German resistance and forced the Central Powers to seek an armistice. As American soldiers began the long process of demobilization and returned to civilian life, many reflected on what they had accomplished in the forests and fields of northeastern France. They had transformed the American army from a small, professional force into a mass military organization capable of decisive action on the world stage. More importantly, they had helped to establish the United States as a global power whose influence would shape the remainder of the 20th century. The Meuse Argonne offensive had indeed been the final Allied blow that forced the armistice. In 47 days of continuous fighting, American forces had advanced 34 miles, captured 26,000 prisoners, and seized hundreds of artillery pieces and machine guns. More significantly, they had broken the spirit of German resistance and demonstrated that the United States possessed both the will and the capability to intervene decisively in European affairs. The last shots of the Great War faded into silence at 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918. But the echoes of the Meuse Argonne offensive would resonate through history. The sacrifice of American soldiers in the forests of France had purchased not just military victory, but America's emergence as a world power capable of shaping the course of global events.